You step into a house in Deir el-Medina around 1200 BCE. The street is narrow and dusty, houses pressed up against each other, almost wall to wall, conserving what little shade there is. The doorway is low, you have to duck, and the first thing you see inside isn't the hearth, isn't a bed, isn't anywhere to eat. Right by the entrance, in the very first room any visitor walks into, sits a strange structure, a low raised platform, something halfway between a bed and an altar, built directly into the wall and painted in a way that makes it impossible to miss. On one side, a squat, ugly creature with a lion's mane, its tongue sticking out, eyes bulging, mid-grimace, almost comic. On the other, an upright pregnant hippopotamus with lion's paws and a crocodile's back. The paint is flaked in places, dulled in others by decades of soot from the hearth, burning in this same house, but the outlines are still readable. The ugly little creature stands with its bandy legs planted wide, almost like it's dancing, and beside the hippo goddess there's sometimes a small knife or torch added into her paw, like she's ready to drive something off. This isn't random decoration. This is the first thing anyone crossing the threshold sees, placed with more prominence than the hearth, more than the bed, more than anything else in the house. And here's what's strange. Nobody left behind a single inscription explaining what the thing was actually for. Structures like this turn up in nearly every excavated house in this village, always in the same spot, always with the same two figures. And we have at least 3 serious theories about what it was, and scholars still haven't settled which one is right. The man who lives here, walking home in the evening from his job in the Valley of the Kings, will walk past this platform without a second thought. To him, the answer is so obvious that the idea of explaining it to anyone would seem bizarre. 3,000 years later, that self-evidence is exactly the problem. The answer's coming at the end. For now, a completely different story. Here's what's strange about daily life in ancient Egypt. We know an absurd amount about specific days in specific people's lives, right down to who skipped work on a particular Tuesday 3,000 years ago and why. And yet, we can't say with confidence what the most prominent object in their own living room was for. This isn't a knowledge gap in the usual sense, it's a very strange, very uneven map. Hour by hour resolution in some places, total silence around an object that stood in every single house. The reason for the unevenness is almost always the same. They weren't writing for us, and they weren't writing for history. They were writing for a specific bureaucratic reason. Log a worker, record a debt, report to a supervisor. Whereas what the platform by the door was for, every child in that village knew from birth, and explaining it would have been about as useful as writing a letter to a friend explaining what a front door is. What's obvious to everyone alive at the time is the hardest thing to reconstruct 3,000 years later. That's a genuinely uncomfortable thought for anyone trying to reconstruct the past. The more important and more ordinary a thing is, the smaller the chance anyone bothered to write it down for our benefit. So today, we're going to build a full picture of one ordinary day out of this uneven map, and along the way, explain that thing by the door. Let's start with time, because time in Egypt was structured nothing like yours. Hours, in the sense of fixed equal intervals, didn't exist. The day was divided into 12 parts, and the night into 12 parts. Always 12, regardless of season, which means a summer daytime hour was physically longer than a winter one. Nighttime hours were tracked by the rising of 36 star groups, one after another, and it's from this system that our own division of the day eventually grows. People woke up long before sunrise, because in this climate, the sun isn't a gift, it's a problem. So the heaviest work got done in the first cool hours, and by the middle of the day, when the heat turned genuinely dangerous, work nearly stopped, giving way to shade, food, and a short sleep before picking back up toward evening. The day was divided not only into hours, but into roles. The farmer headed for the canals and fields, the craftsman in Deir el-Medina headed toward the Valley of the Kings, to cut and paint the tomb of whichever pharaoh was currently reigning, the woman in the house ground grain into flour, and the scribe, if you were lucky enough to be born into a literate family, went somewhere that involved no pickaxe at all. The farmer, meanwhile, lived on a completely different schedule. His day was dictated not by a state shift roster, but by the Nile itself and whatever was growing on its banks, with no scheduled days off, but with long enforced pauses when the river itself decided it was time to rest. The craftsman at Deir el-Medina lived on a particularly unusual schedule. A 10-day week, 8 days of work in a row, and 2 days off, and during the working stretch they didn't come home each evening. They slept in temporary stone huts up above the valley to avoid burning energy and daylight walking under the blazing sun twice a day. Home only on the weekend, once every 10 days. The whole crew was split into 2 gangs, right and left, each with its own foreman, and above both foremen stood the scribe of the tomb. the man who kept all those records of absences and reasons that would later become a goldmine for historians. Work wasn't loosely supervised either. How much got done per shift? Who was falling behind? Who needed to be medically cleared after a scorpion sting before being allowed back on tools? And who simply needed a day to sleep off what was clearly an excessive evening the night before? And above all of this sat an even larger calendar, not 4 seasons, but 3, each of which was essentially a job description. The flood, when the fields were underwater and farming was physically impossible. The emergence, when the soil was soft and you could sow, and the harvest, when everything had to be brought in before the next wave of water. It was during the flood months, when the agricultural workforce sat idle, that the state pulled people onto the big construction projects en masse, not out of cruelty, but because you had to feed that idle army of hands anyway, and it made more sense to put them to work. Which means time in Egypt existed at 3 different scales simultaneously, hours measured by stars and shadows, the 10-day week measured by shifts on the build, and the year measured by the rising of the river. And all 3 ran in parallel without the slightest concern for syncing up with each other the way our calendar and time zones do. Next, food, and what it did to the body. Breakfast looked essentially the same for almost everyone. Bread and beer, and not as 2 separate menu items, but as a single system. Thick, low-alcohol barley beer was closer to liquid food than to a drink, and it stood in for water, which was frankly risky to take straight from the Nile. On festival days and whenever the household could afford it, onions, garlic, lentils, dates, figs, grapes, and Nile fish made it onto the table, and for those who could manage it, meat, usually for an occasion, not as an everyday staple. The bread, though, was genuinely dangerous to your teeth. Sand blown in on the wind, sand ground off the millstones, went straight into the dough, and you can see the result on surviving mummies. Teeth worn, nearly to the root even in people who didn't make it to 40, with abscesses in the jawbone big enough to spot with the naked eye on a skull. And yet life around that food was strikingly clean. Egyptians washed multiple times a day, used natron-based compounds to clean the skin, oiled themselves against the dryness of superheated air, and the famous black eyeliner, according to residue analysis from surviving cosmetic containers, was made from recipes containing deliberately synthesized lead compounds rather than just ground-up natural ones, quite possibly not only for beauty, but because the mixture may have cut the risk of eye infections in a country full of standing water and flies. Everyone wore that eyeliner, men, women, children, but even here the wealth gap didn't disappear. The elite had finely crafted cosmetic implements and imported perfumes, while an ordinary craftsman had a plain, crude jar and whatever could be made at home or traded from a neighbor. A woman's workday started even earlier than a man's, and the most punishing part of it was grinding grain. She'd kneel in front of a flat grinding stone, put the grain on top, and push a second stone back and forth across it, with her whole body weight behind it, hour after hour, to produce one day's flour for the family. Skeletons of women from this era carry the direct imprint of that work. Worn down knees, deformed toe joints from bracing constantly, arthritis in the lower spine severe enough to see on the bone without any special analysis. And those same women, according to Deir el-Medina's own documents, owned property, bought and sold land, brought cases before the local court and won them, and could initiate divorce on their own initiative, legally freer than the Greek women who'd come along 1,000 years later, but with a spine being slowly destroyed by one unchanging daily motion, repeated thousands of times a year, year after year, without a single day off from that particular obligation. And in the evening, once the workday ended, Egyptians had a pastime worth talking about on its own, because it leads directly back to our mystery by the door. It was a game called Senet, a board of 30 squares, pieces that moved according to set rules, something like a very distant ancestor of backgammon. Senet turns up not only in houses, where it was clearly played in the evenings for fun. Senet turns up in tombs too, including Tutankhamun's, where several sets were laid in for him, some of solid ebony and ivory, obviously far too luxurious for a casual evening game and obviously intended specifically for the afterlife. And here's the strange part. By the late New Kingdom, texts describing the journey through the afterlife start making direct references to Senet as a metaphor, or even a literal trial the soul has to pass on the way to eternity. An ordinary board game for a family evening turns out to also be an instrument you place in a tomb to help the deceased play a match against an invisible opponent for his own place in eternity. In the house, Senet is how you kill an evening with a neighbor or a child after a hard day in the valley. In the tomb, that same board, with those same 30 squares, becomes a map of the journey after death. Certain squares were understood to correspond to dangers the soul would face, and winning the match symbolically meant a safe passage into eternity. Nobody rewrote the rules or redesigned the board, moving from one context to the other. The object is literally identical. Only the stakes at the table change. The line between just entertainment and religious object in that house was apparently far thinner than seems natural to us today. The children, meanwhile, weren't idle. From an early age, boys were pulled into whatever work they could manage, fetch this, carry that, watch the younger ones. And the few lucky enough to get into scribal school faced learning to read and write on fragments of that same broken pottery, copying the same text over and over until the hand memorized the signs. Those exact fragments survive. A child's handwriting, crooked, uncertain hieroglyphs, sometimes with the teacher's corrections marked beside them. Literacy in Egypt was, at best, the province of a few percent of the population, and it was the one reliable social elevator there was. A scribe didn't swing a pickaxe and didn't wreck his back over a grindstone, which meant sending your son to school was the single smartest bet a craftsman's family could place. And there's another side to evening life that the sources are surprisingly candid about: dreams. A genuine dream book survives from Deir el-Medina, a papyrus listing dreams and their interpretations, formatted as, if a man sees himself in a dream doing such and such, that's good, it means this. If he sees such and such other thing, that's bad, it means that. Drowning in a dream, bad sign, trouble incoming. Pulling out your own teeth with your hands, an omen of a close relative's death. Seeing yourself drinking warm beer, also a bad sign, which is fairly ironic given how much of it they drank while awake. But seeing your own reflection in water, that's a good sign, an omen of a long life. The list runs line after line, dozens of entries in a row, with no explanation of the mechanism anywhere. Just a table of observations accumulated, apparently, across generations of interpreters, and written down, clearly not for a general audience, but for professional use. Somebody in that village most likely made a living interpreting dreams for the neighbors in exchange for payment or a favor, exactly the way somebody today makes a living doing therapy. The person who compiled that text treated dreams not as random noise from the brain, but as a fully legitimate channel of communication with something larger, one requiring systematic, almost bureaucratic analysis. In precisely the same businesslike tone the scribe used to log who showed up for work. And speaking of logging who showed up, this is where Deir el-Medina becomes a goldmine for historians. The villagers wrote absolutely everything down on limestone flakes and pottery shards, because papyrus was expensive and broken pottery and stone were lying around everywhere for free. Lists survive of who came to work and who didn't, with the reason written next to each absent man's name: stung by a scorpion, building his house, burying his mother, drinking with a colleague the night before, his daughter was menstruating and the household needed his help. Debt notes survive, complaints about neighbors, love notes, children's writing exercises, somebody's inventory of missing donkeys, somebody's complaint about the quality of their laundry. None of it was meant for the future. These are the scratch notes of one working day, thrown out that same evening, which happened not to rot because they landed in the dry climate of the desert. And in one particularly memorable year, under Rameses III, when the state rations of bread and beer ran 18 days late, the workers simply put down their tools, walked out of the valley, and sat down against the walls of a mortuary temple, refusing to move until they were paid. Officials showed up the next day with promises and talked them into dispersing, and a few days later, the rations were late again. So the men walked out a second time. Their own words are recorded on the same flake. We are hungry, 18 days of the month have already passed. We have been brought to this place by hunger and thirst. We have no clothing, no oil, no fish, no vegetables. This isn't a grand political declaration. It's a dry accountant's grievance delivered as an itemized list, and that's exactly why you believe it instantly. It is the oldest documented labor strike in human history, carried out by the men building the tomb of the God King himself, against the administration of that same God King. None of this is a monument built specifically to be remembered 3,000 years into the future. It's garbage that happened to outlive the people who threw it away, purely because they threw it into a dry desert pit instead of into a river or a fire. The irony is that the pyramids and temples, built precisely for eternal memory, tell us far less about the living human being inside that civilization than one accidentally surviving flake on which a scribe hurriedly scratched that a worker took the day off for his mother's funeral. A monument tells you how power wanted to be remembered. The garbage tells you how people actually lived. And in that sense, a broken piece of limestone turns out to be more honest than a golden mask, because nobody specifically prepared it for the eyes of posterity. That's exactly why we know more about one specific Tuesday of one specific stonecutter than we do about why that thing was standing by his door. So now we've got a whole scatter of unconnected details from a single day on the table. 3 parallel systems of time, teeth worn down by sand in the bread, a board game that doubles as a map of the underworld, an official dream book with bureaucratic precision, limestone flakes full of complaints about the neighbors, and the first documented strike in history. On their own, just curious facts, but together they sketch a portrait of a culture in which there was almost no gap between ordinary and significant. Any object, any activity could at any moment turn out to be not merely practical, but religious, not merely domestic, but eternal. Now we can go back to the mystery we started with. Here are the 3 theories seriously debated in Egyptology, and not one of them is fully proven. The first theory is that it was a birthing bed, and this one has probably the most intuitive logic behind it. Childbirth in ancient Egypt was lethally dangerous for both mother and child. Judging by skeletal remains, a significant share of women of childbearing age died specifically from complications of childbirth, and it happened not lying down but in a squat or a half crouch, sometimes literally on a pair of bricks, assisted by midwives and neighbors. That raised platform by the entrance may have been literally where this took place, and Bess and Tauret, painted directly above it, weren't decoration but active protection at the most vulnerable moment of a woman's life. The grotesque, frightening appearance of these deities was meant to drive off the evil spirits and demons believed to attack most eagerly at exactly the moment new life enters the world. The position right by the entrance makes sense too. The mother and newborn were deliberately kept in the first days closer to the boundary between the house and the outside world, under double protection, walls and gods at once. The second theory is that it was a household ancestor cult altar and had nothing to do with childbirth at all. In this reading, the platform was used for offerings to dead relatives. Bread, beer, flowers, incense left there regularly to maintain a connection with those who had died, but whose well-being in the afterlife was believed to directly affect the well-being of the living. Egyptians had an entire tradition of what are called letters to the dead, where a living person would literally write a deceased relative a letter with a request for intercession or a grievance, and such letters were often left at household altars, not only in tombs. The position right by the entrance is logical in a different way here. The ancestors guard the house from the threshold, literally greeting and seeing off everyone who comes and goes, standing watch over the boundary between the outside world and family space, exactly the way a modern person hangs a photograph of a dead relative near the entryway, or lights a candle in their memory on a particular day. The third theory merges the first two into a broader reading. The platform was a multi-purpose family shrine tied to fertility in the widest possible sense. Conception, birth, the health of the infant, and the continuation of the family line as an unbroken cycle, which the house marked with a single location across all its stages, rather than with different objects for different occasions. Not a bed specifically for birth and not an altar specifically for the dead, but the point where the arrival of a new family member and the memory of the departed met. Because for the Egyptians, these weren't opposing processes but tightly interwoven parts of the same larger cycle. The same deity who helped a child into the world also guarded the memory of those who had already left it. The argument between these camps has been running for decades, and each side has real weight behind it. Supporters of the birth theory point to the unmistakably obstetric iconography. Tauret, in virtually every other known context, is tied specifically to childbirth, not to the afterlife. Supporters of the ancestor cult theory counter that the fragments of offering vessels found near some of these platforms look far more like everyday ritual libation ware than like anything connected to childbirth. And defenders of the third, unifying reading simply point out that the very attempt to split this into two camps may be a modern habit of classifying everything, rather than a reflection of how ancient minds actually worked. Egyptologists don't ultimately pick one, and neither will I. Too few direct texts, too many circumstantial hints pointing in different directions. But notice what all three readings share. In every one of them, the most ordinary, most everyday point in the house, the first room you walk into off the street, turns out to be the place where birth, death, and protection from the unseen all converge at once. And here's what's worth taking away from this day as a whole. We're used to drawing a hard line between the everyday and the sacred. Work over here, religion over there, weekday separate from Sunday, and architecturally there's usually no dedicated place for it in a modern home at all. For Egyptians, that boundary apparently just didn't exist, and that doesn't mean they were more devout in the sense we'd assume, walking around in a constant state of pious awe. It means the categories we treat as opposites were, for them, simply adjacent compartments in the same drawer. A board game for an evening's entertainment gets laid in a tomb as spiritual equipment. A dream book gets read with the same business-like seriousness a scribe brings to logging attendance, not as a mystical text, but as a reference manual, almost technical documentation for how the world works. A strike against the God King's own administration gets recorded in the same flat, bureaucratic tone as the list of absentees. And the most prominent spot in the house isn't the bedroom or the kitchen, but a platform, joining birth and death, standing right by the door. So protection starts exactly where the house itself starts, and no member of the family could enter or leave without passing that boundary between the everyday and the eternal. Think about that specific house we started in. The craftsman comes home in the evening from the valley, dusty and exhausted, past that same platform by the entrance. Whether he was born on it or not doesn't really matter here. And he walks past it every single day of his life without thinking about it, exactly the way you don't think about it crossing the threshold of your own apartment. For him, there was no question about what it was. The question only exists for us, on the other side of 3,000 years of silence. And that silence, rather than the object itself, turned out to be the most eloquent evidence of all. That for Egyptians, the boundary between life, death, and the protection of the home didn't run through a temple miles away. It ran right at their own front door, every single day. So next time you walk into someone's home and the first thing you see is a mirror in the entryway, a mat with a message on it by the door, or a horseshoe hung above the frame, ask yourself, what from your own home will archaeologists be digging up 3,000 years from now? And what 3 competing theories will scholars propose trying to work out why it was even there? Tell me your version in the comments and what you think they'll find in your house. See you in the next one.